traditional owners, past, present, and rising, and their continued connection to land, country, and community, and extend that respect to any First Nations people joining us here today. So as we gather here today, we're also reminded that country is just not a place. It is a living relationship of law, culture, and responsibility. So in this spirit, the theme of our session today, from obligation to opportunity, measuring impact and positive duty, really takes a special meaning. For the Larrakia people, obligation clearly has always been about a matter of kinship, reciprocity, and responsibility to one another. And when we talk about positive duty, it's about how do we embed that sort of kinship and reciprocity and responsibility in the context of our organizational work on positive duty, because we know that positive duty challenges us to carry those same principles in our workplaces and institutions, being part of what I call the regulatory value of an organization, an opportunity to create cultures of safety, respect, and belonging. So just in terms of these thought leadership webinars, take note that these thought leadership webinars are here for purposes of really building that knowledge base, but also creating a bit of a market space for positive duty interaction with those of you that are working within the positive duty space, or just wanting to sort of gain a better understanding of what positive duty is. We started off this webinar series, or this thought leadership series, through what we call Project Butterfly, which was a way in which we create that butterfly effect of positive duty enablement across the 6 regions of the Northern Territory. So clearly this session is clearly about knowledge generation, but also about the way in which you network with each other here post these sessions. So before we start, just a bit of introduction to our speaker today, Royden. So a brief bio. So Royden is clearly a big picture thinker, as he calls himself, in terms of believing that we all have a role to play in shaping a better, fairer world. He's the head of advisory, exceptionally skilled at bringing together people, data, and insights to drive better decision-making and unlock meaningful impact in communities. So ImpactInstitute believes in organizations that have a responsibility to create meaningful and measurable social change in our communities. So with that, I hand over to Royden to inspire us on how we can create an impact in our organizations through our positive duty engagement. Thank you, Royden.
Thank you, Jasmine. And look, thank you everybody for the opportunity to speak today, and thanks for that acknowledgement of country and the traditional owners and things of the land that we're on today. I am in Darwin with you today, and if any of you would like to connect at all after the session, I'll share my contact details and things. I'm here for the rest of the week, and more than happy to catch up with anyone that's interested. I'll just share the presentation, and hopefully that all comes through smoothly. So measuring impact has always been very central to my interest right through my career. I started in development and aid agencies, working in refugee zones and war zones, and working with very disadvantaged people and communities, often with extremely limited resources. And I know for many of you working in the Territory, that's a situation that you're very familiar with, both in terms of the immense needs and opportunities across the community, and also the incredible limitations of resources and things. So front of mind for us was always how we measure impact and ensure we're achieving the greatest impact within the resources available to us. And I continued that interest as I explored public health in aged care and disability services in Australia. And then for the last 17 years or so, working within ImpactInstitute, and looking at how to understand and measure social impact across different kinds of organisations. The reason we focus on and measure impact is ultimately to improve the lives of people and the quality of our communities. And as we commence the session today, I'd just like us all to reflect a little bit on how we each contribute to creating a community that's inclusive, that values all Australians, and where all Australians can feel a deep sense of connection and belonging. Contributing to creating that is good for all of us. It's good for our children, and ultimately, even for those in corporates and things, I believe it's also good for business. I spend my career working on impact because I believe each of us individually and all the organisations, whether non-profit, government, social enterprise or corporate, can and should contribute to making our community stronger. And we achieve that best when we're clear about what the impact is that we want to achieve, how we want to contribute to that, and where we then measure and keep learning and inspiring others through what we do. We all benefit from the strength of our community and we should all contribute to making it stronger. It's often attributed to Gandhi, the statement that our strength as a society is ultimately reflected in how well we create pathways and opportunities for the most disadvantaged. And I'd encourage us all to think about how we can achieve that better. And as we think about social impact and how we integrate positive duty in social impact, my fundamental challenge to us all is to think about how we can create an Australia where we recognise the strengths and value the contribution of all members of our society. We need to get beyond just tolerating differences and instead enter relationships being willing to learn from each other, value each other, and grow together as a community. And if that's our focus, I think we'll certainly achieve our positive duty obligations, even as a byproduct of that focus. So how should we think about positive duty? It requires our organisations to prevent unlawful conduct, not just to respond to it, to take reasonable and proportionate measures to prevent and eliminate discrimination, sexual harassment and victimisation to the greatest extent possible. So when you think about that, do you first and foremost see that as a responsibility or as an opportunity? Do you look at it through a compliance mindset or through a growth mindset? Today, I'll encourage you to look at it through the lens of opportunity with a social impact lens. I'll build on a little bit of what George Liakos shared last week for those of you that were able to join then as well. George talked about the important links between values, beliefs and behaviours and how this ultimately translates to outcome and impact, how difficult it can be to shift a person's underlying values, and so therefore how important it is to select an aligned team. Today, we're kind of going to work back on it from the other direction. We're going to look at the value of an impact focus in organisations. So starting with the impact and working back to, well, how do we achieve that impact? So I'm going to begin by just discussing a little bit of how we understand social impact and why we suggest placing it front and centre within an organisation. When we talk about becoming impact focused, we're talking about how organisations contribute to long-term sustained positive change for people and communities. So impact is an expression of your purpose and how it relates to the long-term sustained change for your customers or participants and other stakeholders that you interact with. A key challenge we often work with organisations on is how do you translate your purpose into impact? Or how do you ensure that your customers and clients or participants are experiencing what your purpose is as an organisation? For those of you that come from non-profit, social enterprises or government organisations, perhaps some of this is self-evident that your primary purpose is in making a difference, in building social capital. However, even here, it's easy to get distracted at times with all the various compliance requirements, all the day-to-day of running your organisations, trying to keep sufficient funding in place to operate your organisations, and your primary purpose or the real impact that you're wanting to achieve can begin to get lost. In businesses, though, the importance of an impact focus is perhaps less self-evident. Many businesses take the view that the only real way they need to invest in community is through their taxes, and some even try to avoid those. There can be a tendency to want to extract from the community to generate profit. There has been some fresh reticence around this and thinking about social impact with some of the pressure that's been pushing back against ESG from the USA at the moment, that's been impacting global companies operating in Australia, as well as more broadly having an influence on directors and boards and things in some Australian companies. In reality, though, the business and community will both be better off if they actively invest in strengthening the community they depend upon for their profitability. So in reality, an impact focus makes good business sense. I would argue that the vast majority of businesses started with a purpose beyond their profit, and it's less about adding something new than getting back to their roots and what really drove their early success. So why put impact first? When you're really clear about the impact that you want to have and you gather and measure it, you gather evidence of the degree to which you're achieving that, it enables you to do two key things. One is to keep improving the programs that you're working on and to get more efficient in the way that you allocate resources to those programs. So to think about what's really most significantly contributing to our impact, what's contributing less so and why. Are there things that we're doing that are no longer contributing to our impact? So it helps with that allocation of resources. It helps refine and improve the different programs and services and things that you're delivering. Equally, it helps you tell your story effectively and to connect really well with stakeholders. So it provides that emotional connection. When you can tell your story in a way that connects both emotion and evidence, you tend to really see the greatest impact through what you're doing. So it can lead to increased support and revenue. It can lead to clients wanting to receive services and support from you because they trust you. It can help your team engage more, and it can help increase trust across the broader community in your organisation. But it can even do more than that. When you bring together the story and the evidence and people build trust and confidence in your organisation, you begin to be able to achieve a whole lot more within the environment that you're working in. That may lead to people purchasing more from you, donating more to you, volunteering more with you. But even more so, it can lead to people responding more to your advocacy or changing policies and things around what you're doing. There was a case study I came across recently from the Marangouka and Burke Tribal Council, where they were offered government funding, but were concerned about the model, and they ended up rejecting the conventional approach as to how the funding was going to be implemented in their community. Instead, they attracted philanthropic funding to what they wanted to do and then put really strong measures of impact around it. And when they were able to go back to government saying, look, this is how we want to go about the program in our community, and this is the evidence of how that's being effective within community, they were able to change the nature of the dialogue and the conversation that they were having. They were enabled to position more as an equal partner of government and in their funding negotiations, rather than just a recipient of that funding and having to just follow through on the policies that were being brought to them. For businesses, though, there's still been an active debate. But even in that business context, I believe it makes good business sense. And I'm going to just touch on that briefly. I don't know what the mix of businesses in the meeting today is, but for those of you that are. So the question we often get from business is, does taking a focus on social impact reduce our financial returns? If you think about it in a non-profit or a government department, does it make us less efficient in the way that we operate? And we find that this question is really at the centre of whether organisations decide to take a compliance approach or more of an impact approach. The compliance approach being, we think it is going to decrease our financial returns, so what's the minimum cost way that we can find to meet our obligations? And that's in contrast to an impact approach, where an organisation would be looking at and saying, well, how can I best add value to people and community in a way that will also add value to my organisation? The evidence for this is still debated, and it's not absolutely clear cut. So there's more research needed around it. But a few things that I would share around some of the things that are emerging around it. A recent Wharton ESG initiative, so looking at investment in social impact projects or organisations trying to achieve an impact, found that most of the funds that they were working with didn't feel that they had to sacrifice financial returns in order to focus on social impact. If you look at the MSCI KLD index, which is a social index, it's consistently outperformed the S&P 500 in the USA over 25 years. Now, again, there's some debate around the interpretation of that, given the whole sectors that it includes and excludes when you look at that index. But again, there's some promising data there. Impact Frontiers says, well, it depends a little bit on context. When they triangulated it and put it all on on charts that looked at, well, what's the financial return different organisations achieve compared to the social impact that they achieved when they were investing that area, they found it actually depended a little bit from business to business, but that in most cases, businesses were able to achieve both, and in many cases, it left them better off. Global Institutional Investor found that investors increasingly demand alignment with climate, human capital, and governance priorities. The BCG Trust Index found that high trust levels, that companies that achieve high trust levels show materially higher shareholder returns. And there's various others and things as well that I could quote. The bottom line is an impact focus can deliver at least equivalent returns, and in many contexts, better returns, or in a non-profit or government context, greater efficiency or ability to invest in purpose. The other thing that we find with it is that the conflict between impact and shareholder returns for those that are in the corporate space diminishes the longer the time horizon that you look at. In businesses, we believe looking at both social impact and financial returns creates a healthy tension that managers, boards and leadership and things should look at and think about carefully and make decisions around, rather than just ignoring or making assumptions around. We believe that while there can be a tension there, it's actually a healthy tension, and in the best interests of both the organisation and the community, for directors and leaders and things of companies to really actively wrestle with the issues. So applying it again more broadly across all sectors and organisations, why is impact measurement helpful? It's helpful because it creates alignment. If you're clear on the impact that you want to have and how that's connected with the values and beliefs you have as an organisation, it helps create alignment across the organisation. You're more likely to attract and retain the right people. Your people are more likely to make decisions that align with the impact that you want to have and that are perhaps lower risk decisions and that are in the best long-term interest of your organisation. It enables you to tell compelling stories to your stakeholders, whether they're donors, customers, employees, your community relationships, and so on. It enables you to build trust and accountability. So when you have a bigger purpose that's clear to your stakeholders, and when it's clear that your commitment to it is not just tokenistic, it builds trust and keeps you accountable to your stakeholders. Trust leads to longer term relationships with staff, with customers, with donors. And similarly, at some point as an organisation, you will face a crisis. And the extent to which you've built trust will significantly influence how you're able to manage things through that crisis and how quickly you recover out the other end of it. It improves staff engagement. Most staff, particularly younger generations, want to work for a company or an organisation that believes in something bigger than shareholder profit. And the more that that's clear, authentic and genuine, the greater staff engagement, retention, and the greater the willingness of staff to put in discretionary effort to try to achieve the best for the stakeholders that you're working with. It reduces risk. When the needs of people and community are front and centre, risk is often thought about earlier and better managed. A reduction in risk can add a lot of long-term value to organisations. And ultimately, we believe it can, as a result of those things, also lead to better financial results, no matter what the structure of your organisation. I'm going to touch now on a few different frameworks that we look at and that we think about when we think about impact and when we think about how you integrate positive duty into an impact perspective on the world. One of those is the impact-driven organisation. Fundamentally, what we're thinking about with this is how do you achieve change, or how do you achieve something of value? And that's ultimately through an expression of your intent, so you wanting to achieve something of value and taking some kind of action. So the things that you do. In a business sense, your intent is expressed through your culture. The actions you take are expressed through your operations. Impact then is always in the context of stakeholders. So there's key stakeholder groups we think about very broadly are your personnel, and that includes staff, contractors, anybody that's engaged with your organisation in delivering services, your customers, which could be your clients, any of the people that you're working with on a day-to-day basis, beneficiaries, donors, and so on, your members or shareholders if you're a corporate, and the community that you work in that includes all of the different ways that you interact with the community, including with your procurement and other things. So the more that you can be clear about your intent and what it is you want to achieve for those stakeholder groups, the more capacity you have to align your culture and your operations to achieving that impact. So the impact-driven organisation model is a useful way to just think about, well, who are our stakeholders? What are the key components of our operations? And we have breakdowns of those further. What are the key contributors to our culture? And how do we make sure that they're all aligned around the impact that we want to have and fulfilling our positive duty obligations? Another framework that we think about is an impact framework or a theory of change. And for those of you familiar with Stephen Covey's Healthy Habits, we encourage you to approach an impact framework or theory of change beginning with the end in mind. So thinking first about, well, what is that impact that we want to achieve for the different stakeholders? So it's helpful to go back to the model that we were looking at earlier and say, well, who are our stakeholders? What's the key impact that we want to achieve for the stakeholders that are most important for us? And then to think through, if we want to achieve that impact, what are the outcomes that we need to achieve in order to get there? What are the programs, services, and initiatives and things that we need to run if we're going to be achieving that? How do we need to interact with our community and our customers? What does that mean for our procurement? What does that mean for the culture and things within our organisation? So how is this all relevant to positive duty? If you look at it in the context of the impact-driven organisation model, positive duty relates to all of your stakeholder groups, except perhaps the environment. Most strongly, it relates to three of them, to the community that you're operating within and fulfilling your positive duty to that community, engaging that community, to the personnel and employees and things within your organisation, and to the customers and things that you work with and the clients and so on that you engage with. If we look at it in a very oversimplified way and how we might apply an impact framework or theory of change to it, you might say, let's say that we wanted to increase trust that creates long-term customer relationships. An outcome that we might want to achieve might be to ensure that our customers feel culturally safe, that our customers know that we always act fairly and impartially in the way that we operate. Now, this is very oversimplified, and in reality, it should be framed for customer impact first rather than around the business impact first. But since I don't know what each of your organisations do, I've just started with a very simple model. You can apply the same to staff. You can apply the same in other situations. When your organisation lives and breathes a desire to contribute something of value to the community, and that's not just tokenistic, staff are more likely to want to engage, clients are more likely to want to engage. You're likely to operate much more effectively and have a much greater impact as an organisation, as well as being more successful as an organisation. So start by building your impact framework and then simply come back to that and review to what degree have we now covered our positive duty obligations in the way that we've built that impact framework and in the impact that we want to have for our key stakeholder groups, or to what degree are there still any gaps that we need to make sure that we fulfill in order to fill it in. In most instances, what you'll find is that your commitment to impact gets you 80 or 90% of the way to fulfilling your positive duty obligations. And then there may just be a few little gaps and things around that you want to fulfill. The process that we go about to do that, we call the impact journey. From bottom to top here, what it looks at is what your purpose as an organisation is and how that's connected to the impact that you want to have, so the difference you want to make for people and community. The different dimensions that we look at around that to achieve it are, first of all, our stakeholders, to say, well, who are our stakeholders? How do we make sure we really listen carefully to those stakeholders, that we understand their language, what they value, what's important to them? How do we make sure that they're an active part of building the way that we work and the things that we want to achieve as an organisation? Once we've identified those stakeholders and really engaged with them and listened to them and understood their point of view, we suggest also going through a process of research where you look at what else there might be, what else is done in your sector, what has government explored previously, what have academics found when they've looked at similar industry areas and models and companies and things to the one that you're operating, and what can you learn from that adds to what you've heard from stakeholders or fills any gaps that you might have in it. We then suggest building an impact framework or your theory of change, then building an evaluation model around it to measure the degree to which you're able to achieve those things that you're setting out to achieve. And from that, to drive continuous improvement and communication. That's ultimately not linear. As you keep improving, you can keep on going back and reviewing, well, where do we need to tweak things? How does that change how we evaluate? Do we need to go back and listen to our stakeholders more and get some fresh insights around something that we've been learning as a part of that process? Stakeholders are absolutely central to what you do. We find a lot of the time organisations make a lot of assumptions about what stakeholders think and about the language they use and what's going to connect with stakeholders. When we think about impact, one of the things that we always encourage organisations to do is to put stakeholders front and centre and not to make assumptions about what people who are actually living in the environments that you're working in or the environment that you're impacting in some ways through the way that you operate, really think and really want to see you achieve within their communities. I'm not going to go through in detail at the moment, but there's a process around how you build an evaluation framework and different ways that you can evaluate and different approaches to evaluation suit different organisations and different contexts. And if anyone's interested in diving into that further, I'm happy to work through that with you. But when you're thinking about an evaluation plan and how you'll go about measuring that impact as an organisation, the starting point is to think about what your purpose is and your intended impact. So what's the purpose of the evaluation? What impact is your program or service or the way that you procure or whatever it is about your organisation you're trying to leverage for impact? What is it trying to achieve? And then why are you evaluating? What's the purpose of it? Then to get to your key evaluation questions, what are the main questions the evaluation is seeking to answer? And how do these questions align with your strategic goals as an organisation, or how do these align with your stakeholder priorities? You can always measure a lot of things, and a lot of things can be interesting, but you're not ultimately research organisations. You're live operational environments that are focused on delivering some kind of value to the community. So you need to be very disciplined in choosing what you actually measure and what you prioritise in your measures and how you go about implementing those measures in a way that makes operational sense to your staff and that your clients don't feel that they're becoming research subjects rather than beneficiaries and things of your service or a community that you're engaging with through your service. Then think about your theory of change. What is that underlying logic? Have you put sufficient evidence around that to be really confident in that theory of change that you have in place? What assumptions have you made and what are the risks around it? Then design the evaluation and your measurement plan. What outcomes or outputs or indicators will be measured? You don't just measure at the impact point, you need to measure along the way to check that you're doing what you said you were going to do in the first place. And how are you going to keep your stakeholders engaged in that measurement process? And finally, then around the implementation and integration, what are the systems and tools or processes that support that data collection and analysis? And how can you integrate that in your ongoing operations, not have it sitting off to the side and not really engaged with the things that you're doing? So to sum up, I would encourage you to lengthen the time horizon that you're thinking about so that you can put impact front and centre. And I think when you do that, you'll find that it's very strongly aligned with the things that you're wanting to achieve from a positive duty point of view. Engage your stakeholders, develop an impact framework that has really good evidence around it. Do a review of it and make sure you haven't missed any of your positive duty requirements and that your compliance needs are covered in that framework. and then go about evaluating that impact. And with that, I'm happy to open it up to questions and discussion. And while we're doing that, I just note, I know it's very short notice, but if any of you are interested, we've got a workshop where we're taking a deeper dive into this that I can share with you tomorrow. So tomorrow morning, if any of you are interested and happen to be available, I can share the links and things to it. And equally, I'm happy for Jeswyn or Steve, or at the end of the session, to share my contact details if anybody would like to connect and discuss any of this, or dive into it a bit deeper and look at how it applies to your particular context or organisation. So Steve or Jeswyn, happy to pass back to you from there around questions and discussion.
Well, thank you, Royden. That was really very educational in terms of the ecosystem, I would say, of impact measurement, but importantly, how you bring back that impact measurement to social value. And I think that's integral in the work that we're doing in relation to positive duty. Before I sort of sum up the session, I'll perhaps just open the floor here to questions. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand.
Thank you, Jeswyn, and thanks for your presentation, Royden, really useful. I guess my question is around organisations, as you mentioned, are time poor. They don't have, a lot of organisations are time poor in terms of their staff. They don't have a lot of capacity to do great research. In terms of the impact, sometimes when you're thinking about the impact of a program that you're running, I'm thinking about purpose-driven organisations or non-profits here, but you can think about what you're doing in terms of costs you might avoid, potentially costs to government in many cases, and also more externalities or more of those kind of benefits that you achieve that might be a little harder to quantify. For organisations that are wanting to dig into that a bit more, do organisations like yours have like a data gateway or somewhere where you can see what is the typical cost that you might save by housing somebody, or this is a typical benefits you might get by reducing, say, homeless or drug and alcohol addiction? Do you have metrics like that that are generally accepted now in terms of running business cases or running grant applications that are persuasive, to avoid everyone having, I guess, to try and retrieve those stats themselves?
Yeah, look, there's a number of dimensions to the question. In terms of a readily available data warehouse that we host for that, no, we don't. But there are different ones around. So there's been a lot of work done around the Australian Social Value Bank that some of you will be familiar with, that's got different indicators and measures and things that are fairly simple to apply in organisations. It looks at it from a very outcomes-based perspective. Last week, TOMS launched in Australia, so that's Themes, Outcomes and Measures, which is another UK-based model like Social Value Bank. It does a similar thing to Social Value Bank, but it looks at inputs and outputs rather than looking at outcomes from it. So many companies find that suits them better, where they're reluctant to make projections about the outcomes, but say, well, we can measure how many apprentices we provided, we can measure how much purchasing we've done from particular types of organisations and things. So some corporates are looking very closely at the TOMS model. There's an increasing number of Treasury departments around Australia that are doing their own work in some of this space. So in New South Wales Treasury and Victorian Treasury and things, there's a number of documents that Treasury's released that are relevant to different sectors, where they're talking about if organisations are wanting to put a business case to them, what they would find as a credible way to put that business case to them. They don't say, well, this will give you a return, X will give you a return of Y, but they do say, this is the methodology we want you to apply to arrive at that for your organisation. That in itself can take a lot of cost and complexity out of it, because you don't have to, to look at all of the detail around that for your own organisation. And the other thing you can do, and that we often do with organisations, is to look at academic literature and government reports and other things, to look at where there's very similar models to the one that you're applying, and what's been found in those models. When you look at then applying it in your own organisation, which is the other dimension of what you asked, it is very difficult in operational environments and when you're resource constrained to look at imposing more and more measures within organisations. So generally what we suggest is looking at your theory of change or impact framework and then getting very disciplined about prioritising about what you need to measure and why. So what really substantiates whether you're delivering service in the way that you plan to and in the way that's most important to delivering the outcomes that your theory of change says. When you do that, if you're really confident that you're delivering services on a best practice evidence-based model and where you've got good measures from other research around what comes out of it, you can put a stronger argument to your funders and things around saying, look, we've got good measures around this. We know we're delivering spot on according to this model. And so we're in a better position to project that we're likely to be achieving these, these outcomes or this impact through it. The other place you can go, but there's differences, is there is a lot more work that's been done in this space in the UK, and there's lots more work that's been done in this space in the US. There are big banks of data and measures available out of both of those jurisdictions. But of course, you have a bit of a credibility problem at times as soon as you apply them into the Australian environment, which is a different context, but they can give you a bit of an indicative idea of what people are finding elsewhere on them. And finally, on the issue of credibility to government, it varies from Treasury Department to Treasury Department. Some of them see the ASVB model as quite credible, like they understand the limitations of it, but they understand what sits behind it and how what the assumptions are and things behind it. And so they're quite happy to look at that and to compare within sectors, so long as it's not used to compare across sectors. Others often look at it with a much more sceptical eye and really say, well, we don't like the whole concept of converting non-financial indicators using financial proxies into financial indicators, and we really only look at the more direct economic values of things that have a direct dollar value to them, which can still be some of the things you referenced around cost savings and some of those kind of things, but that they're reluctant to look at some of the things that don't have a direct financial indicator. So it does ultimately depend a little bit audience to audience. And look, if you want to dive into that more with your organisation or your particular context or stakeholders, happy to chat about that more afterwards as well. Are there any other questions? Yes, Stephen.
Yeah, Royden, I was most interested when you're talking about being able to tell compelling stories to your stakeholders. And I just wonder if you've got any advice here, a particular government program that doesn't have enough to do it's what it believes it needs to do. Are there ideas or things we could think about in terms of what are the compelling stories? Are they, case studies? Are they any reports? Are they media releases? Any thoughts there in that sort of context?
Yeah, and look, it depends a little bit on who your primary audience is. One of the things that we say, first and foremost, is make sure you think about the communities that you work within and the beneficiaries and things in those communities and how they're going to connect with the stories that you tell. If you create a whole language around your stories and things that's going to connect really well with the Treasury Department, but is offensive to the community that you work in, you're obviously going to have a problem with trust and things there. So even if Treasury is one of your primary audiences, first think about your communities, and about the people that you work with, and make sure that any stories you're going to tell that they're going to see the value in that story, that they're going to see themselves within that story. And sometimes that means not telling things that you would really like to tell, and that's just a reality of it. Once you've thought about that, let's then come across to an organisation like Treasury and think about that. Or let's come across to not just Treasury, let's think about any funder. So a high net worth individual, a corporate foundation, and so on. When you're dealing with a private donor who might be looking at donating $50 to you, you'll often find that your case studies and telling a story that gets people emotionally engaged is enough for them to say, yep, look, I'm willing to put that in. What we find, though, is when you start talking to people about $20,000 or $50,000, $100,000, $1 million or whatever, in much larger, people that are able to contribute in a much more significant way, they generally have a lot of people also coming to them and asking for money. So they look at things through a much more skeptical lens. They will listen to your story that's emotionally engaging and they'll say, that's fantastic. Love the emotional engagement of it. But then they'll say, but anyone can tell us a good story. What evidence do you have that really supports that story? And that's where you need to be able to back it up with data and evidence that shows them it's not a one-off that you're cherry picking. It's actually representative of what your organisation's achieving as a whole. And what we will generally find is if you can tell the story in that way, you tend to be able to engage your donors and funders in it in a very different way than where you're either only giving them data but not emotionally engaging them, or where you're only emotionally engaging them but not supporting it with the evidence.
Thank you. Yeah.
Kwame, I noticed you. Kwame, did you still have a question there? Kwame, if you are trying to talk, I think you're muted. Otherwise, if anybody else is also trying to ask any questions, just let me know. Jeswin?
I might jump in while Kwame makes adjustments and getting on board. Royden, I'm really sort of interested in terms of that context of impact and outcome. So how do you avoid measuring the outcome as an impact?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, both are important. So it's not a question of measuring one or the other. And at the end of the day, different organisations will define outcome and impact slightly differently. And some will split outcomes into short, medium and long-term outcomes, and your long-term outcomes are getting very close to your impacts and so on. When I work with organisations on it around strategy, my general approach is to say to them, it really helps your organisation tell a compelling story if you've got one or two really important things that sit at the centre of what your organisation's trying to achieve in terms of the positive change it's trying to achieve for people and community. So they're the things that we tend to put in that impact bucket to say, what's the most important thing that you're really trying to achieve for the people that you're working with? And then we work everything else back from there. There's other workshops and things that I do that look at then how do you go about that measurement? How do you choose what you measure? Because having defined that impact, a lot of organisations say, well, what I really want to do is measure that impact. The challenge with that is the impact is also the hardest one to measure. It has the most confounders. So there's the most other people that are also contributing to that impact. It's not all yours. So you've got issues of attribution and things with it. So the impact is not the only thing you want to measure, but it's a core thing that you want to be thinking about, and it's a core part of what you want to be measuring. You also need to be measuring things at the outcome level, at the output level, at the activity level. Because if you've got a really strong theory of change and you've said, well, this is how we need to deliver services to achieve that impact, these are the key enablers of that impact, these are the key barriers that get in the way of that. If you don't take those things into consideration and you just measure the impact, you might find, well, we're not achieving the impact. Well, why? Yeah, was your theory of change wrong? Was it that, or was it just that you didn't actually deliver services in the way that you said you were going to deliver those services? So it's not that the measures of output or activity and things become unimportant. It's just that you've got to prioritise and say, well, which are the ones that are most important to achieving that impact that we want to have? And then what are the most important measures at the output level? What are the most important measures at the outcome level? And what's the most compelling way for us to think about measurement at the impact level?
Thank you. Any other questions? Kwame still got his hand up, but I'm not sure if he can use your microphone there, Kwame. Okay, so if there are no further questions, I'll perhaps just sum up. So I like how you started talking about Gandhi, Royden, and another one of my favorite quotes from Gandhi is, be the change that you want to see. Yeah. When we talk about positive duty work, it's really about you being the change in your organization for that cultural transformation, because we all become bystanders for each other within this space. It's not just left to legal or HR. It's an organizational duty that's put in place. We talked about responsibility versus opportunity, and we shared about how impact is really measuring this impact is really an opportunity for the organization. And I think positivity creates that responsibility also for each person in the organization, so they can actually capture that opportunity and operationalize it in a way that has, number one, that regulatory impact that we need to do as regulators in terms of monitoring this, but also then that social value that it brings to the organization. I really like how you talked about placing impact front and center, because a lot of times there's what we call impact leakage. Because as you said earlier, we don't sort of get to measure this because it gets lost. So if you're putting it front and center, it becomes a point of reference in terms of our focus within the organization. And I think we clearly need to do better within that space. And the way in which you use impact to sort of talk about that story as evidence, and I think that's super important, because that evidence also means data in terms of what we're collecting, and that data speaks towards the storytelling that we want to move forward with. I think clearly all of this goes to that fact that we're trying to actually achieve social return of investment, the SROI, in terms of what we're putting in the organization. I really like the point that you've said about emotional connection, because the way I look at positive duty is that it provides an organization to invest in emotional intelligence into the organization because of the way we treat each other, and because of the way we are proactively sort of trying to engage with these issues before they become a problem or before discrimination occurs. I really like that point of how, we look at the organization from that impact-driven organization you talked about. Also, the fact that it's not just in terms of personnel within, but also within the supply chain, and that's so important. So in the Northern Territory, our positivity applies not just 24 protected attributes, but also it applies in 7 areas, and the 7 areas can also cross into supply chains through goods, services, and facilities, and the other areas that we deal with. So that's clearly important in terms of how we measure our impact through the influence we have with other organizations. And of course, that point that you note in terms of that cultural safety, it's really key. Stakeholders are central. We can't forget that. They are part of, they are why we are here sometimes in the work that we are doing, especially here at the Commission, in terms of how we deal with the equality of opportunity gaps and the equity gaps based on the disadvantage and disproportionality. And clearly, just to end on your point in terms of lengthening that time horizon, I think we really need to think deeper, bit of deep time diligence in terms of how do we lengthen that. And I think you've given us some fundamentals here. So thank you, Royden. For those of you interested, there's a workshop that's happening here in Darwin, but also clearly keep the conversation going with Royden and ImpactInstitute in relation to this work on measuring your impact within the space. And we'd love to hear from you down the line in terms of how you're measuring your positivity performance in this area. So thank you all for attending, and keep these conversations going with yourself. Be in touch.